Hello, my name is Blake Hegeman, Deputy General Counsel with the Virginia Association of Realtors. Thank you for joining me for another edition of Legal Hotline Q&A. Today I'm going to tell you about an interesting scenario I got in one of my classes. And one of the cool things that we get to do with the legal department is visit local associations throughout the year and get to hear some questions and feedback that we wouldn't otherwise know about unless we did these visits. One of the more interesting questions I got was in a big seminar class, and a hand came up, and the broker said, I was doing a showing, I was the buyer agent, and my buyer was actually filming inside the property. Now, this was particularly interesting because the buyer's husband was overseas serving our country, and what was the reason behind the filming was every house that the buyer agent took the buyer to, the buyer wanted to film so she could then send it to her husband who was serving our country overseas. This would help them make the decision easier together if they both saw the house. All right, so the buyer filming, walking through the house, and the buyer agent's phone rings. And it's the listing agent. The listing agent's very upset. So the listing agent says, why is your buyer filming my client's property inside? And the buyer agent said, how do you know my client's even filming your client's house? Well, we're actually filming you right now, and we hear what you're saying. Okay, so now that raises two interesting scenarios. And people do disagree on this, but in my view, even though the buyer's motives were noble, in my view, buyer agents should have a conversation with buyers at the beginning of their relationship saying, you cannot film, take pictures inside a listing unless we have the listing agent's permission, and if they're not represented, the seller's permission, okay? It's before you film, take those photographs, there's a million reasons why you should get the listing agent's permission or the seller's permission if they're not represented. Okay? Now, on this other side of the equation, it's even more complicated. As a listing agent, you're under no duty whatsoever to discover whether or not your client is filming a buyer or buyer agent going through the house or just filming whatever. You don't have to ask your client at showing, at a listing appointment where we're trying to get the listing, hey, we've talked a lot about your house, but let me ask you this. Do you film people when they come in your house, like, for example, buyers and buyer agents? You don't have to ask that question. But if they tell you they're doing it, or you discover it through some other means, that your seller is filming buyers and their agents with sound as they're going through the seller's property, I think that generates some concerns and risk concerns on your part. So some attorneys argue that a seller filming a buyer and a buyer agent having a conversation is violating Virginia's wiretap laws, which essentially says that if there are two or more parties to the conversation, and we're all having a conversation, and I consent to the recording, or we all agree to the recording, then it's a legal recording. But in this particular situation, it's not clear if it applies. But I think it could. And in this situation, the seller, think about it, if the seller is filming the buyer and the buyer agent, the buyer and the buyer agent are having their conversation. The seller's just listening. They're not a part of that conversation. So one could argue that they are violating the Virginia wiretap law. So it could be illegal if the seller is filming and recording without permission of the buyer and the buyer agent. What I always recommend folks do if they're running into these situations is as the listing agent. Again, you don't have to discover it, but if somebody does tell you or you discover it through some other means, you do need to let your client know via email or some other writing, I don't know, seller, if this is legal in Virginia. You videotaping with sound the buyer and the buyer agent without their knowledge. I need you to go see an attorney to determine for your protection of mine whether or not this is legal. More often than not, they'll say, I'm not going to go see an attorney about this. Another possibility is you can suggest that they put a sign up outside? Well, if you're concerned about buyers and buyer agents in your home that they might do something wrong, I recommend that you inform them or put out front that the property is under surveillance, or right inside the door that the property is under surveillance and being recorded. That's putting folks on notice. If they say, no, I'm not going to do that, I think that you really need to talk to your broker. And your broker might want to talk to counsel and determine whether or not there is an ethical or legal risk for you in proceeding with this listing. You might want to ask for a release. You might want to terminate it. You might determine there's not enough risk and you want to proceed. But in my view, I can certainly see a code of ethics panel, although there's not an ethics case right on point that I can think of, or a regulatory panel, although I've not heard of an exact case, find that there is a violation in one way or another. I just think it creates risk when you're recording someone else's conversations without their permission. So, with all that background information being said, I think it's a risky environment. The law is evolving on the issue, but I always like people to err on the side of caution and go through the steps we talked about. And brokers, you can always call me on the legal hotline if you run into this situation. And folks, be careful, and I wish you the best of luck out there.